Okay, I think as it's 3 minutes past, we'll make a start. So welcome to the Dementia Open Forum at UEA. As Dan has said, if you can keep your cameras off while we present, because then the recording is made and then uploaded to YouTube, and then we can keep it anonymous if people's cameras are off while the presentation's going. After the presentation, there will be time for questions, and this will not be recorded, so you feel free to put your camera on at that time if you want to ask questions directly, or feel free to put questions in the chat, and we'll get to those near the end. So today is rather a strange session because I'm introducing myself as the presenter, but also my colleague Scarlett Fountain, who's also on the call. So I will start sharing my slides and we'll share the presentation. Just get those going. Okay, can everyone see those?
Yep, sorry. We can see those. Yep, we can see those.
Thanks, Dan. That's great. Okay, so I'm Tamara Backhouse. I'm a research fellow at the University of East Anglia, and I'm leading a study looking at improving personal care assistance for people living with dementia in care homes. My background is as a care worker in care homes, and then went into academia in psychology, sociology, and ever since my PhD, I've been researching dementia care, care homes, sometimes home care, and sometimes hospital care, but mostly care homes. Scarlett, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Scarlett. I've been working with Tamara for over a year now on the Optimised Demcare project. So that's sort of my main duty at the moment. And I've also got experience as a care worker, and I've recently just completed my PhD. So this is sort of my first postdoc anyway in this area.
So that's the team. Yeah, so just to say, what is personal care assistance? So what we're really talking about is hands-on help and assistance with activities of daily living, such as washing, dressing, going to the toilet, but it might be hair washing or teeth cleaning, skin care, nail care, assisted eating, those kind of activities when somebody gets to the stage where they need actual physical help. So I need to say a disclaimer, the study and myself are funded by the NIHR. And the views expressed in this publication are those of myself and Scarlett and other co-authors, and not necessarily those of the NIHR, NHS, or the Department of Health and Social Care. I also funded researcher through the ARC East of England as well. So as a little bit of a background, as people living with dementia, their condition progresses, they require more and more assistance with personal care, so those daily tasks. And sometimes it can be prompting, but then it might move on to physical help. So my research and Scarlett's research very much focuses at the end, at that point where people are needing that physical help. And sometimes when people need that physical help, it can be really tricky, and the person with dementia, for lots of legitimate reasons, might refuse help. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And also we know that care home staff's dementia training can be quite limited. So sometimes it's often about what is dementia. Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia. Here are the symptoms, memory loss, confusion, those kind of things. And it's not always about how best can we approach somebody living with dementia, and how can we work with the person. So we aim to develop care home staff training to improve personal care assistance and reduce refusals of care. By making personal care assistance better, we hoped refusals will reduce. So here's a very sort of crude model of refusals of care. So we start with the person with dementia and the caregiver, and they're in an environment at the beginning there. So that's what we're starting with. And the caregiver attempts to assist in some way with personal care. And this can be really acceptable for the person, and they can cooperate and care is delivered. Or it can be unacceptable to the person, and apologies that E has dropped off there. and they may refuse care. And this can be for many reasons. They might not understand what the caregiver's doing. And I think we'd all refuse care if somebody came to undo our blouse or shirt and we didn't know what they were doing. It doesn't feel right. So, or it might be the person's in pain, or the caregiver approach is a bit abrupt, or something like that. It could be for many reasons. At this point, we can, as a caregiver, employ some kind of care strategy, encourage the person, or work in a different way with them, and then care may be delivered. But it becomes quite tricky if we leave the person and each time we approach them, they may still refuse, because at what point do we go towards possible neglect and the person's not getting washed and dressed? Or if they wouldn't accept care and it's got to a really late point, maybe, and the person's been incontinent, and at that point, something has to happen. So, maybe a decision that the minimum care is completed, and, this sort of takes us feeling uncomfortable towards, doing something against somebody's will and abuse. So it's a really tricky area of care. So we have a chance to step in, perhaps, and improve care interactions at this beginning point. Is the person with dementia in pain? Is the room too cold? Is the caregiver ready and got everything in place? So we might make changes at this point. Or we could make changes at this point where the caregiver attempts to help the person with personal care. Perhaps we can look at their approach and really try to make a difference here. Can we approach the person in a way that's acceptable and comfortable for them, so that they're more likely to accept help? Also, we have another point here. If it is unacceptable to the person in some way, what do we do? Our actions here could make a difference. So there are areas along the refusals of care journey where we can perhaps make a difference. So we're using the framework for co-production and prototyping of public health interventions to develop our training. Now, our training is not a public health intervention, it's a social care training intervention, but it's a really good framework here by Hawkins and colleagues. So there's a stage at the beginning about information gathering, so evidence review and consulting with stakeholders to begin with, to get your evidence in place. Then there's the co-production stage, where you discuss the content, agree the content, feedback, disagree, refine it, change it, feedback, and go through that cycle until you've got something you're happy with. And then there's the prototyping stage, where you perhaps test out to see if it's any good, you evaluate and see what you can learn about it, and then you might change it again and refine it a little more. So that's the framework we've used to develop our training. So first of all, we looked at evidence from past research, but we also conducted interviews as part of this. It's something called a realist synthesis. So we were looking at the mechanisms or the reasons why a person living with dementia might accept help with their care. So that's what we were interested in. What are the reasons? What can we do to help somebody accept care? So we found that trust and safety in that care interaction was really important. So if the person trusted the caregiver and they felt safe within the interaction, they were more likely to accept help. So the caregiver here might be doing something like reassuring the person, approaching them in a way that's not towering over them, telling them what they're doing, just making the person feel safe. A positive connection was really important as well, and this was usually before care. So has the caregiver connected with the person in some way before they've started the care activity? So, saying hi, talking about the weather or your journey into work or whatever, just making that connection, not necessarily about care, and probably better if without it, so the evidence says. So just, connection as a human being before the care begins. Giving the person with dementia a sense of control, so offering them choice, but also checking in with them that they're, okay with what's going to happen. And actually, if the person's not able to give consent, it's just about telling the person what you're doing as you're doing it, just to enable them to go along with what's happening. Care feeling manageable was really important. So this was around, it might have been a really big activity to suggest a shower to somebody, and it might feel that that's really beyond the scope of what, it's such a big thing to go and have a whole shower, whereas actually if you make the care manageable by just starting by washing hands and face, or giving somebody a strip wash, or just saying, should we just start with washing your feet and then we'll see if you want the shower or not. But it was just adapting care. So maybe instead of a wet shave, somebody would have an electric razor or a beard trim instead, if they didn't feel that the full care activity was manageable for them anymore, or just on that day. Comfort was really important. So this encompasses physical comfort, but also emotional comfort and sensory comfort. So physical comfort is the person in pain. Are they comfortable where they're sitting or where they're going to be for the personal care? Are they emotionally distressed before care? Because actually that's not a good time to start some personal care. So actually making sure that person's okay. And actually, can they see, can they hear, are there sensory comfort in place? So is the room too cold, too hot, too noisy? And can we make any changes there? Needs and preferences came out as really important. So obviously care staff are paid carers and they're not family members, so they don't know the person inside out. So it's really good for them to learn about the person as best they can from the person's relatives, from the care plan, in whichever way they can, maybe even through trial and error. So they know the person's needs and preferences. And then once they know those, they can adapt the care to make it acceptable for the person. Working together came out as really important as well. So this was doing a shared activity. Come on, we'll do this. So it didn't feel like you need to do this. The person with dementia was more likely to accept if they felt it was a shared enterprise. There was a common goal and they were working with the carer towards that. And engaging the person. So this might be engaging them in the care activity, maybe holding a towel or a flan or something like that. Or actually, if they were quite not very happy with the care activity, or maybe slightly distressed, engaging them with something else like music or singing to help them through. So those were our findings from our previous research review and from the interviews with some lovely stakeholders. But it worked in this way. So the person living with dementia was more likely to accept care at the top. And we found that trust and safety was like the key part. All of these components underneath fed into the trust and safety of the person, and they interlinked as well. As you can see, the relationships there via the double-ended arrows or the single-ended arrows. And this has been published, so if you're interested in that, please do take a look. It has a lovely table in it with a list of all of the actions that we found that could help a person be more likely to accept help with their personal care. Obviously, everyone's different, and not all people would react in the same way to the same strategy, but it gives the list of strategies we found. So I'm going to pass over to Scarlett for the next part, which was getting some more information in that evidence base before we co-produced our intervention. Thanks, Scarlett.
So for the context mapping phase, we aim to determine the contextual elements relevant for refusals of care, and also the central mechanisms for staff training, which sort of fed into the co-production process of the training. And then to inform sort of the future feasibility trial, we aim to explore the outcomes relevant to residents and staff, and then also their recording practices. So we visited 4 care homes in rural and urban settings, and we conducted interviews with 40 people in total. And that was a range of care staff, residents and relatives. We also screened 7 care records and looked at 4 care home policies too. So overall, we found for what is important for assistance with personal care. Number 1 was completing the care activities. Number 2 was relational safety. 3 was resident empowerment, and 4 was comfort. So when we're looking at completing care activities, this had 2 aspects to it. So the first aspect was personal hygiene. And this was viewed very important from residents. So we've got one resident saying, and I feel uncomfortable by not having a shower every day. And then we actually had 2 separate residents quote the same thing, which was cleanliness is next to godliness. And then the other aspect was sort of a health perspective. So this was mainly important or seen as important by relatives. So we've got one relative saying, you know, by wearing those support bras, that would reduce the chance of that rash occurring as regularly. And then the relational safety, that had 3 aspects to it. So we're looking at connection, reciprocity and confidence. And connection was seen as important from staff members. And that was about building a trusting relationship with the resident to enable a positive care interaction. So we've got one staff member that says, have that connection and talk to them about the weather, family members, dogs, whatever they loved or still love, to get that trust. Reciprocity was about a 2-way relationship between the resident and the care staff. So not only was it the care staff giving to the residents, but also the residents feeling like they were giving something back to the care staff. So we've got one resident quoting that the staff are here to be helpful, but in return, you've got to be absolutely nice and honest. They love coming in my room because it's a happy room. And then confidence was seen as important by staff members. And that was about giving the residents confidence in, you know, what staff members are actually doing. So letting them know what they're doing and feeling confident within those actions. So we've got a staff member quoting, and they feel confident with you as well. They know what they know that you know what you're doing. And then resident empowerment was surrounding dignity and independence. And now dignity had 2 different perspectives from staff members and relatives. So staff members associated dignity with enabling privacy for residents. So that was, you know, not invading their privacy, whether that was during personal care. So maybe like placing a towel over them while they're helping them with a wash, or, you know, not invading on their private life as well. So we've got one staff member who says, you know, dignity is not invading their privacy. And then relatives had a different view on dignity, and it was about maintaining their appearance of who they once were. So we've got one relative who quotes, it's keeping her presented how she would have wanted to be presented, just dignity, dignity, dignity. Now, for the other side of empowerment, residents didn't quote anything to do with dignity. They actually spoke about having independence and control during personal care. So one way of having that control was having a routine. So we've got one resident who says, I know that the routine is best for me, and we work it out between us now, and I do have that feeling of independence. Although, of course, I haven't got it, but that's not the point. I feel I have it. So there was that element that residents could find independence on the dependence on care staff. And then some residents found it quite difficult to be under the control of care staff, and perhaps their time routines and actions, and felt that sometimes this made them feel like they'd lose their independence. So one resident quoted, I still haven't grown used to being under the control of someone else looking after me. Now, comfort was, again, 2 aspects to it. So there was the emotional comfort or the emotional experience of care, and then the care actually feeling achievable. So we've got one resident who says, I think I'd want them to try and make a bit of an effort to get to know me and my background. And that was to offer reassurance and enable the resident to feel emotionally secure during a care interaction. And then we've got a relative that quotes, they warn what's going to happen and say that she feels comfortable. So again, it's about offering reassurance, letting the person know what's going to happen so that they feel fully aware and comfortable during that interaction. Now, care feeling achievable, we've got a staff member who says, but if they'd like that help, I'm always there. And I say, can you manage to do that? It's because they've been stripped sometimes of so much. So it's about making sure that every action is achievable for that relative, for the resident. And then a resident said, I can manage my teeth, and now with my left hand, I can comb my hair. So again, it's about those little moments and allowing them to do things on their own so that they're still feeling like they're achieving within that care interaction. Now we'll go on to stakeholder consultations. So this was a 1-hour face-to-face or online consultations with 35 stakeholders. And this is where we discussed the training content and the care home training processes and methods. And this was to determine the intervention priorities for content and flexible delivery, which also fed into our co-production of the training. So looking at the training content, stakeholders endorsed the idea of trust building or trust-based care between the care recipient and the caregiver. So finding out about and connecting with the individual, so knowing their life history, knowing their likes and dislikes, so it enables the caregiver and the care recipient to make a good connection. making care more manageable, so sort of adapting care to make sure that care still feels manageable and achievable for that person. And then also identifying and addressing unmet needs. So, you know, if someone's refusing care, is it because their needs aren't being met? Are they cold? Are they hot? Are they too, you know, in pain, for example? Some stakeholders were uncertain of including coping with challenges in the training. And what we mean by that is looking at ways to deal with refusals of care. So refusals of care are quite like a broad range in nature. And sometimes, you know, having a one-fit-all guide to dealing with refusals perhaps wasn't viewed as achievable for this training. So they sort of advised and said you could have a few ideas, but not narrowing it down to, you know, this is what will work for this refusal, because every person refuses care many different ways. Now, when we're looking at ways to make changes at the care home level, stakeholders endorsed a baseline assessment for care homes. So actually going into the care home, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't, and making like a formal commitment to change with the manager. So having that manager on board could help boost morale for the training. They valued internal or external trainers. So internal trainers were viewed as valuable because, you know, they had a good morale, a good relationship with staff, but also external trainers were valued because, you know, there was someone new, maybe someone exciting that's sort of new to the home that could bring a different upbeat to sort of training. And then they also liked the idea of an end product for staff, such as giving them a certificate so they feel like they've achieved something following the training. And then also a champion role, or a Demcare champion role. And this would be someone that would lead the training, support the staff following the training, so implementing the training and practices. You know, if staff were struggling with personal care with someone and they wanted to talk through it with someone, this would be the champion role's main sort of responsibility. Some stakeholders were unsure of this role, mainly because some of the stakeholders we spoke to have heard of champion roles in different areas of care and said, you know, sometimes there's a burden with this, there's not much reward coming from the champion role, and, you know, they're not given much protected time, so it is sort of a burden on their already current roles. Looking at ways or methods that training could be delivered to staff. So stakeholders preferred group sessions, using active learning approaches within those group sessions, and then using a reflective activity following the training over one-to-one sessions or online learning modules and a test following the training. And then ways changes to care practice could be supported. So stakeholders endorsed ongoing check-ins with the trainer. So in this instance, it would be the champion. So, you know, regular check-ins with the champion to make sure that staff are still implementing the training, are not struggling with anything. They also endorsed an evaluation or assessment after the training. So again, this fits in with a reflective activity that, you know, doing this as a sort of a way of retaining knowledge after the training was seen as valuable. They also endorsed creating 1 to 3 personal care assistant goals for residents. Now, this could be with the care staff in the home that know the residents very well. It could be the relatives, for example, but this would actually help them work towards something for that person as well. And then they also valued resources like physical toolkits, posters and pocket guides with actions on that could help them remember things they've learned from the training, ways they could tackle refusals of care, for example, or ways they could implement different actions. And they didn't really like resources such as online methods, so things that would require logging onto the internet and getting, you know, PDF versions up. They didn't like a directory of best practices or manuals because they said these were often overlooked by care staff. You know, if a manual was given to a care home, it was often put in the staff room or put on the shelf and never looked at again. So that's where we're at with the stakeholder consultations.
Thanks, Scarlett. So I'm going to talk about the co-production. And so all of the research we've talked about up till now fed into the co-production. So we had, you know, the realist synthesis of the interviews, the context mapping with more interviews, and then we had the stakeholder consultation. And we took this evidence into co-production so that we could build an evidence-based training intervention. So what did we do to develop the intervention? Well, we had myself and Scarlett, 3 relatives of care home residents and 5 care home staff, and we met for 2 hours for 10 weeks at the university. So 2-hour meetings over a period of 10 weeks. And we had 1 resident and 1 relative advising the process. and we worked together quite dynamically. Actually, we had a really dynamic group who also had other underlying skills. So one of the care staff was the trainer at a care home, so we could tap into their training skills. We also had family carers who had skills in creative methods, but also in drama and things like that. So we could draw on the wider skills of these people, although we categorise them as relatives, care home staff, and the resident. So we spent these 10 weeks, and the co-producers were reimbursed for their time, and they also were paid an extra hour each week for any homework or preparation, reading, or anything that between the meetings. And we had discussions, we had creative activities to develop the training activities, and it was really productive, and we tried very hard to get people to have an equal say and people to have some kind of power within the co-production. And Scarlett and I really went to this trying to share the power, but we found actually it was quite difficult when we knew all the evidence. So we had to find ways of distilling the evidence to our co-production group so that they could be informed and make decisions for the training that were evidence-based. And that was quite tricky, not to have it as a kind of teacher-student relationship from us trying to impart all this information, or without having to print loads of detailed stuff for them to read, and which was quite highly burdensome. So we found different ways of doing this. Some of it was presentations at the front, but we tried to limit that and have discussions as well. And then during our creative sessions, we would bring in, Scarlett would often bring in, because she was heavily involved in the stakeholder consultation, she would bring in, well, the stakeholders generally thought this, so that we could inform our decisions in the co-production. And there was lots of learning happened from all of us. Researchers, we learned about how to sort of step back, and it was okay to let things happen and lose a bit of control. I think the family carers learned a lot about the care home setting, and the care home staff very much found that they were learning about the relative aspect, but also how research worked or how training could be developed. And the resident really enjoyed inputting with one-to-one meetings with Scarlett for 5 weeks, and then we would feed in her thoughts as well to our co-production processes. So there's some more photographs here. There's lots of smiling on these ones. We had lots of serious times as well. We also had cake, laughter, and yeah, a really productive time. We critiqued our training. So we developed the training, and then one session we said, right, we're going to go through the training. So facilitated it ourselves and undertook it. And with that, one of the activities we started again. It was too time consuming and not very active participatory in nature. So we thought, how can we best get this information across in a better activity? So we were self-critical as a group and started again. So it felt like we got some kind of safety, so the co-producers could say, I don't like this, and that was okay. So yeah, and we've just published with our co-producers in Health Expectations around our co-production journey. So this came out maybe 2 weeks ago, and because at the beginning of each session we had post-it notes, and we reflected on our learnings, we reflected on our fears and what was going well each time. So at the end of the co-production process, after the 10 weeks, we collated those and we wrote up our findings of our processes and how we'd found working together. And it really looks at the journeys of researchers, staff, and relatives in that. So what did we end up with? Some training. So we ended up with optimized DemCare training, which is actually a pack. So it is a train the trainer training, but it's a pack rather than an actual session or lots of sessions with the trainer of the trainers. the actual trainers who are DemCare champions, and we did consider in the co-production, do we go with champions, do we not? And we decided to in the end. So the Demcare champions, which are between 1 and 3 in each care home, they get a pack, and it's the whole training pack of everything they'll need, all the instructions, a badge, certificates, everything is in this pack. So the Demcare champions work through the training pack at their own leisure, and then they put on the training at the care homes to train the other staff members. And that's how it's cascaded. It's set up so there'd be no more than 10 staff members at each training session. So there's enough for good and rich and fruitful discussions, but not too many that you lose the chance for those discussions as well. And there are some group work. Some of the activities have people getting into pairs or into 3s or 4s. And then we're hoping that beyond the training, these Demcare approaches from the evidence will be put into care practices to improve personal care assistance for people living with dementia in the care homes. So that's how the training sort of works. So for residents, it's underpinned by something called self-determination theory. And this is that if somebody if they feel competent, they feel they've got autonomy and they feel related or belongingness, then they can thrive. But if these things are thwarted, then they're going to struggle. So in terms of a resident living with dementia, it's quite hard for them sometimes to feel competent or feel they've got autonomy or control or feel that they belong or are related. So we acknowledge the caregiver's role in helping residents to sort of self-actualize and self-determinate with these things. So in terms of facilitating residents, it's underpinned by this theory of improving residents' competence, autonomy and relatedness. And in terms of staff, it's underpinned by emotional intelligence. So the training really focuses on eliciting empathy from the staff for the resident situation, improving their emotional intelligence, including giving them the language to talk about emotions. It very much is underpinned by adapting to each resident, because as we've said, no person living with dementia is the same. So problem solving, finding out about the person, adapting, making care better for that person. So that's what it is underpinned by. And it also focuses a little bit on staff self-care, because actually, if you don't care for the caregivers, they're not going to be able to care the best way for residents. So there's lots of themes and underpinning the actual training activities. There are 10 training activities. And also these that we went through earlier from the realist synthesis feed into it. So it's about developing that safe interaction, that trust, having a positive connection, giving the person a sense of control or autonomy, making care feel manageable or making the person feel competent. So everything sort of links in the comfort, knowing the person, problem solving and adapting, working as a team together with the resident and engaging them in some way. So we've then taken, if you think back to the Hawkins framework, I don't know if you remember, the third part was prototyping, which is you've got your training and you put it into practice to see what it's like. Does it work? Do people like it? Evaluate it and then refine it and make it better. So we have an acceptability study as part of this with 2 care homes. So we're observing the Demcare champions getting to grips with their training pack. So give them the pack and obviously they consented and they're participants to our research, and we observe them and take notes about them going through and what made sense to them, what didn't make sense to them. We're also observing some of the training sessions, so 5 sessions at each of these homes, and seeing how staff are finding those and how the facilitators might be changing or not changing the activities, how the activities are going, do they work, do they not? And we're also interviewing 15 staff at each home, and there's feedback forms and questionnaires to fill in about the training. So far we're halfway through this, so it's not complete. 1 care home's completed, the other's ongoing. And so far the changes required that analysis is still ongoing, so this is not comprehensive. But we need to change the navigation of the training pack to make it a little more intuitive. So we're thinking about numbering the activities so that the champions are really clear oh, this is activity 1, 2, 3, and just making things a bit more clear as they go through the pack, because we've realised by observing that some start at the top and work through, and others go like to get to the bottom to see all of the contents, and then so it's just about having a better labelled pack, really. We also want to make some additions to some activities. So as we've been watching and observing some of the great points, because staff have a high knowledge anyway and skill, they're coming up with some things, and we're thinking actually we could add that into the training just to make our training a bit more comprehensive. Tweaking some of the activities just so that, okay, so this works better if we do it in 2 groups rather than 3 groups, or this works better. We can start to see by observing little changes. There's nothing too major really, but we can refine it. But perhaps something we do need to think about is the champion support, because in one of our care homes, the champions had quite a lot of power, so that they felt they could arrange the training sessions and get staff to come in or stay late and get that happening. In the other care home, it's a bit different. They're not used to arranging the training. Normally a more senior staff member does that. So it's about liaising with that senior staff member, or making sure in some way that we can make sure that those champions are supported to do that. It's not about delivering the training, it's more about organising the staff to be on site for the training. Yeah, and it seems acceptable. We were very worried about timings. The training's only a 2-hour session or 2 1-hour sessions. And our co-producers were very hesitant about this. So we made one of the activities optional, so that if time was short, it could be left out. And if there was enough time, it could be kept in. But timing seemed to be going well in our observations. The content is highly acceptable to the staff. They feel there's nothing rocket science, but it's something that they should think about and get to grips with. And then they have the pocket cards that they can use in practice. And yeah, the delivery has gone really well. And we've seen champions try the same activity out in different ways. Sometimes disclosing the answers, sometimes not disclosing the answers, sometimes using a whiteboard, sometimes using flip charts, or just discussion. So yeah, delivery seems really acceptable and adaptable to how the champions find it best to get that content over. And also there's some potential DemCare champion benefits through the process. So some are using it to help with their training, to evidence their wider training qualification that they're going for. Some have used it to improve their English, which was English as a second language. So they felt that they'd improved that. So it's quite positive at the moment, but the full analysis might help us find other areas we can improve. And then next steps after the acceptability and after we've refined the training, we'll take it to a cluster randomised feasibility trial. So we'll have 8 care homes, 4 in the East Midlands and 4 in the East of England. And the training will go to the blue homes, essentially. So the training will go to 6 homes, 3 in each region, and we'll have 1 control home that doesn't have the training. But what we're really checking if we can still recruit staff and residents in those homes, well, in all of the homes. How many staff or residents drop out? Can we collect the data we want? What are the outcomes that we can measure to see if this is making any difference? Do the trial processes work? Does the training have, can we overcome the barriers? Have we noticed all of the barriers or facilitators to get the training into practice? And then we want to see if it's, if it's acceptable, if it's delivered as intended, how many staff get the training, how many staff do all of the training or just some of it. And yeah, we want to also look at cost data. So that's where we are. We're in the middle of those points at the minute, finishing the acceptability. And I just wanted to put up our booklet, which is assisting people with dementia with personal care ideas and tips for carers. This was created in a previous study, but is still highly accessed. So if anybody was interested, it's a list of tips that might or might not work. And it's from an Alzheimer's Society funded study. The QR code is there, and if you click submit, you'll get the PDF version. And then just wanted to say thank you. And thanks to our collaborators and also, importantly, our research advisors. And thank you for listening.